This lecture covers the topic of environmental conservation and protection. Let's get started. This quote from Terry Tempest Williams, a natural history writer, states, "To be whole, to be complete, wildness reminds us what it means to be human, what we are connected to rather than what we are separate from." I like this one, and I may have mentioned in previous lectures that I've worked with one particular Native American community for about 25 years. That's called the Miamia community from the upper Midwest Great Lakes area. And they also have been known, in some ways still known as the Miami tribe, not from Florida, but the Miami River Valley is in northwest Ohio. Anyhow, with my from my work with them, I've noticed in their culture they focus a lot more on relationships and connections between things than they do the separate things. And that just this quote reminds me of that, in that our culture tends to separate things and kind of discount the things in between. But when we think ecologically, we're trying to preserve or honor or protect ecosystems or even species, we have to think of systems. We have to focus on relationships. And as poor humans, we're walking around thinking we're, kind of alone and separate from the rest of the environment, but we're not. And at least that's what I think, and that's what this is trying to say, is if we want to honor and protect our ecosystems and species, and even ourselves, we have to always think about all the relationships each entity is nested within. And of course, we don't really tend to spend much time protecting things that we don't feel connected to or we don't know much about, we don't feel related to. We protect what we relate to and what we think about a lot, that seems like it's really important to us. That's about relationship, like family, friends, etc. So the more we can understand and form relationships with the non-human world that supports us humans, the more we can preserve it better. So I'll start off this lecture too with a case study in the Mway Islands in Indonesia. It's really just a story to illustrate some concepts we're going to be talking about. So I took a surfing trip to Indonesia a few years ago, and I was excited to go there and see the beautiful waves and the beautiful ocean, and as an ecologist as well, just to see this very well-known area of the world, which is super high diversity, some of the highest levels of plant and animal diversity in the world, right? This area between like the greater Eurasian China continent and below, you just can't quite see it on this map, but Australia and these islands in between, like Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Malaysia, they are, again, like almost the most diverse animal and plant ecosystems in the world. So excited to go there, and traveling really far and to a very remote island chain, expecting to be in fairly untouched tropical island ecosystems. And that's at least what I thought I was going to see. And when I got there, it was pretty much what I thought. Look at this beautiful blue water. The island is covered with palm trees and tropical vegetation. Of course, many perfect waves. It seemed untouched and just what I needed for a relaxing vacation. And again, as an ecologist, environmentalist, a really great place to go and just feel like there's some places in the world that are still untouched. Well, that was a lie. I'll tell you what happened next. So I hate to be a spoiler, but that's what environmental studies can do. You can call it spoiling, but you can also call it taking the veil away that says that things are okay and untouched and we don't have to worry about it. I mean, a lot of you already know this, but there's a lot of people that looking at this picture, this is a little bit of higher elevation picture of this island that I was on. It's gorgeous. It's just so beautiful. You know, it's what a lot of people dream of going to for a vacation. And it was a great vacation, but as an ecologist, I started to look at things and I said, why are there palm trees like inland on the, not just on the coast? So palm trees have these huge seeds called coconuts with a big thick fiber seed coat that are meant to be able to float. And they can float for up to 2 years on the ocean and still land on the shore of some land, an island or continent, and they can get pushed up into the high tide area and germinate. So coconut trees are native and wild only along the coastal zone of islands, not inland. A little later, I was up in the kitchen cabana talking to people, and I asked something about, oh, can I get a coconut and eat it and drink it? And they said, no, actually, you can't take one of those coconuts. And I said, why not? And they said, well, every single coconut tree on this island is owned by a large company that produces coconut oil. And if you, every single coconut, even over the surf shacks that we slept in, if they dropped, we're not allowed to pick them up because they're owned. And that the whole island has been mostly deforested and coconut trees planted all over the island, way far from the ocean edge, from the beach, where they would naturally occur. And what you're looking at is a palm plantation. And that has devastated the ecosystem in this very tiny Mentawai island, and indigenous Mentawai people have inhabited these islands for thousands of years, and their lifeways are being threatened because of that. And then, so that's one aspect of the downside of this, whatever my fantasy was about this island. And then we go out and start surfing, and there's pretty, pretty good waves, and they tend to break over reefs. And so I was a little nervous. I haven't really surfed over coral reefs before. But then I started, talking about asking people about the reefs and things, partly to find out what I'm going to, potentially fall on, and or also just about the ecosystems too. And they said most all the reefs in the Mentawais are dead. They're just, and that's what makes them kind of dangerous, is they're sharp. They're dead, sharp, not living coral anymore. And I said, well, why? Why all over the place? We're way in the middle of nowhere. And they said because in the 70s, 1970s, around there, and 80s, Japanese fishing companies would come down to the Mentawais and use dynamite to just catch fish. They'd throw dynamite in the ocean, blow up part of the reef. The dead fish would float to the surface. They'd net them up and take them away. And they did this over and over. In all the little islands we traveled to for this trip, they said there was only one island it was about 10 islands, little teeny islands where you could go surfing in different places. Only one island had a little bit of living coral. So that's what I have now removed the veil. If you ever think about that, anywhere you go, you can find these ecological problems, even what seems really remote. And it's important to know about for a few reasons, of course, to know how to protect what's left, to know how to change our behavior as humans to protect these areas, and also just to better understand them too, and to know how we could maybe shop differently. Don't promote the palm oil industry or the coconut oil industry. Don't use maybe so much of it. That does a little bit, but it's just mostly to start being aware of what we're doing and its effects. And on some islands in Malaysia and Indonesia, like on Borneo, a lot of the natural rainforest has been destroyed for palm oil plantations. And that those islands, especially Borneo, is primary habitat for orangutans, the largest arboreal or tree-dwelling primate. They're really important and really unique. So there's big problems here. Some companies, including McDonald's, Nestle, General Mills, Kraft, Procter& Gamble, promised to stop using palm oil from recently cleared rainforest and protect human rights in these areas of the indigenous folks. Whether those promises are being kept is hard to track. International trade, palm oil trade is still going strong. When I hear this, I think, okay, those companies, it's important. They're maybe trying to do something good, but they're stopping using palm oil from recently cleared rainforest. Does that mean they can use palm oil from cleared rainforest that they planted palms in that wasn't quite recent? What's their definition of recent? So they're really sidestepping the whole issue here. So some kind of, again, good to know about. We're taking away the veil. We're seeing what really is happening. Some of these ecosystems contain things, excuse me, that are super important to us and that we value, even if they're not important to human survival. And we really need to see the facts in order to face it. This photo really captures and dramatizes the predicament the orangutans are in their primary forest and being cleared. Tropical rainforests in general, whether they're in Borneo or they're in the Amazon, are very much threatened by deforestation. Logging, grazing, development, roads, starts with roads, but more and more people want to go and make a living in the areas where there are rainforests, and that's causing deforestation, which is damaging to the ecosystems, reducing diversity, animal and plant diversity, and causing a lot of erosion. All kinds of problems go with it, but deforestation is the main threat. It begins, as I said in the last slide, with roads. Deforestation in the tropics begins with roads being built through primary, meaning kind of untouched, primary, pristine tropical rainforest. And then vehicles can get in, materials can get in, people start to set up their dwellings there, clear the land for growing things or having livestock to make money, maybe hunting from there, but kind of the roads are really the start of the problem. It's not so different, it's easy to point the finger at, South America, let's say the Amazon. Why are people burning it, destroying it? But we did the same thing here in this country about 150 years ago. Settlers came in, especially in the eastern United States and Midwest, and took out forest, thick, rich, beautiful forest, and made it into agricultural land, cleared prairies, which is prime soil, really fertile soil, and built ranches and put livestock. And so we did the same thing, completely altering our ecosystems to these very simplified agricultural and ranching systems, which are much more weak ecologically and aren't able to regenerate themselves like forests can. So it's something that's happened all over the world. And to jump ahead a little bit, now we think about, hopefully more and more people think about forests. Trees themselves are part of a solution to our overabundance of CO2, carbon dioxide, in the atmosphere, which is creating and mostly the push behind climate change. Our planet's atmosphere is warming up because there's more CO2, which captures and holds on to more heat from the sun. So every tree and plant, but trees and woody plants even better, they take in CO2 to live and make their sugars from, and they hold on to it. They put it into their body, the trunk, the wood, the branches, the leaves, and they hold on to that CO2 for, a few years if they're just a shrub, but maybe 10, 20, 100, 200, 1,000 years if they're a large tree. And it's like they're storing the CO2, and so it's not in the atmosphere. That's good. More trees, more forest will help be part of the solution to overabundance of CO2 and climate change. Something that came along in the 70s and 80s and started getting implemented in the United States is ecosystem-based management. People stopped, well, not everyone, but a lot of it, and mostly our federal government through like the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service started thinking about protecting the ecosystems they were in charge of in a more a more related way, thinking about whole ecosystems need to be preserved and protected and all the relationships of the different organisms, instead of just protecting the one timber tree or one threatened species that was sensitive. It started to become a catchphrase thing of ecosystem-based management. Of at least though, people were thinking in a more holistic fashion. They were thinking and starting to address problems on national lands like national forests in a way that was more realistic. That's how the ecosystems work, as systems, not as single elements. What really got this going was one of the biggest kind of endangered species media events was when the northern spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest of the United States was listed as endangered. It came flying right up against loggers' rights, these timber companies that wanted to cut the forest down for wood and paper. And they had some rights to that, financial and legal rights to log, but then the northern spotted owl that lived in the old growth areas of the places they wanted to log, these birds became protected by the Endangered Species Act and the habitats they depended on. So they had to be protected, but then the timber companies' rights had to be honored. There was a conflict. During that conflict, it became, I think, people started to really talk about the whole forest ecosystem had to be protected and all the connections of the forest ecosystem to those little patches of old growth where the spotted owls could exist were really important to consider in protecting the spotted owl. You couldn't just save a couple of trees. You have to save all the trees around the trees that the northern spotted owl was living in, and you had to save the rivers around there and the soil. So it's a whole system. That's where this came from. And it's not like every federal agency is doing it perfectly, but it was a big jump ahead from separating things out and just focusing on all of the individual elements to protect and not the relationships. This is put into probably a more succinct way what ecosystem-based management is. Same stuff I said in the last slide, but in text. The Forest Service is in charge of caring for and managing approximately 193 million acres in the United States, about the size of Texas, all of the national forests put together. Their main kind of thrust is to manage these lands, protect them, the forests, but allow multiple use. So allow recreation, allow hunting, but also allow mining, logging, ranching, and other really destructive land uses. So their idea of multiple use doesn't always lead to sustainable management and healthy ecosystems, as you might already know. I couldn't find a picture of it. Maybe they've been banned, but when I worked for the Forest Service, that was in the late 90s. So there was also Earth First, the radical environmental organization, was doing a lot and getting some press. But you'd see these big signs that says, like, when you're driving up to Big Bear, you're entering San Bernardino National Forest, land of many uses. And then I'd see that these environmentalists would kind of cross out uses and write in abuses instead. So kind of funny. But given the fact that there's the logging and the mining and ranching, meaning clearing the forest to make habitat for livestock, those three activities are extremely destructive. And so it is not managing the land in a way that preserves it for the future. And again, as you probably know, National Forest Service is funded by taxes. These are government agencies. So you do have a say, we have a say in what's happening. If they're using or abusing the land and letting these huge mines go in, that's something that people need to know about and talk about and not let it happen. And as people that may be more interested in preserving intact forests, it doesn't mean that we just want to shut down industry. It means that we're considering a long-term viability of these activities on this type of ecosystem. Yes, we need lumber and we need paper. We need areas for livestock in general, unless we turn completely vegan. Um, but we need those, but not in the way they've been done. We also have to think about what humans indirectly rely on, the ecological services provided by those forests: climate regulation, water runoff control, so erosion control, wildlife habitat, air and water purification. Forests are part of the system that creates clouds and makes rainfall. And then, of course, there's the human things of scenic value, cultural value, historic value. But these things we're going to want, whether you own a lumber company and you make a lot of money, or whether you're just an individual who doesn't have a financial investment in our national forest health. The long-term health of that system that we need means, if we think of it and consider the long-term health, we need to change our ways from just these quick extractive techniques that aren't, we're going to be left with nothing, and no one would want that, even the big companies. One method which is less popular and less used than it used to be is clear cutting. Just cut every tree down in a given area and let trees grow back on their own. So it's kind of a nice idea that you could get a lot of wood out of an area in a very efficient, condensed manner, and then the trees will grow back, the forest will regenerate. So nature will heal that, but the time it takes to heal it and the environmental destruction that happens after the clear cut, like the heavy erosion and loss of soil and loss of wildlife habitat, that will take centuries to come back. So it's not really the best idea for the sustainability of the company or the forest. So it's definitely less popular. It's still done, but at least everyone knows it's not the best way forward. Clear cutting decreases diversity of the system, it weakens the system, and any less diverse system like this is going to be much less resilient to some kind of disease or problem, a perturbation. A little bit less destructive and dramatic method of harvesting timber for wood or pulp out of a forest is the shelter wood harvesting technique. And a mature stand is removed in a series of 2 or 3 cuts. So not one big area of clear cut, but there are cuts happen. Early cuts are designed to improve vigor and seed production of the remaining trees, meaning some trees are taken out in some areas and they open up the sun for younger trees to come in. And then later, other trees are removed from those other areas. So it's kind of like staggering the um, the harvesting in one area. In general, we talked about clear cutting. This is shelter wood. There's also strip cutting and selective logging that I'll talk about those next. Great picture of strip cutting. No, this is not a ski resort. This is strip cutting. And timber is harvested in narrow strips to minimize the damage, so you're not kind of devastating a big swath of forest, but allowing for those thin strips have a much quicker recovery time. If you think about it, if you take out these thin strips of forest, all the trees, they're not too far, that open strip is not too far from other forests. So seeds can come in more quickly, birds that drop the seeds come in, wildlife can kind of quickly run between these forest sections. It doesn't damage it nearly as bad, and it doesn't cause as much erosion. There's less wind damage. There's less sedimentation into nearby rivers and creeks and lakes. And again, it regenerates more quickly. And selective harvesting, perhaps the lightest form, the least destructive form, is when just certain trees are taken out. They're selected, some big ones, and especially if they look like they're big enough to produce enough wood. Also, sometimes when they're diseased or been burned, something like that, where just some are taken out and they're carefully hand selected and leaving a lot of other things intact. Again, much less dramatic effect on the ecosystem, the forest ecosystem, and much quicker rebound and regrowth and healing. Another thing we've learned in hindsight is the suppression of fire, as we've done for over 100 years, especially the Forest Service with their big campaign of Smokey the Bear. Only you can prevent forest fires. Forest fires are bad. That whole idea, which now, again, in hindsight, we realize is misguided. It was a kind of a great idea, mostly to protect humans and human structures. But we realize too that the fire suppression has led to massive buildup of fuel, way too many trees and branches and downed trees, an overgrowth, which when there is a fire, true for even this South Coast, Santa Barbara area, when we have fires, they've been so infrequent that there's so much fuel that they get really hot. They burn, they can be more devastating, meaning killing the plants, even the ones that are normally adapted to rebound after a fire. The fire is hotter, the flames are taller, it lasts longer, it can sterilize the soil. They're catastrophic. And now it's been, coming for a while, but at least about 25 years or more. Forest Service people, foresters that have been more forward thinking, and land managers realize fire is an ecological normal dynamic in ecosystems. Sometimes started naturally from lightning strikes, often here, at least on the West Coast and other areas, but even more so here, started by indigenous peoples for thousands of years to clear an area for hunting and to decrease fuel and to rejuvenate the ecology of a site, but done more often, as now we're learning to do, like with prescribed fires, maybe 5 to 10 or 15 years. And if the fires are done more frequently, then the fuel doesn't build up, and it's just a way that helps the ecosystem reduce fuel, dead, down material, releases all those nutrients into the soil, opens up some space for some light to get into the forest and new plants can grow, creates diverse habitats by some areas being more burned than others, so you get more of a diverse habitat types. So it really is a positive thing, especially in grasslands and prairies, but also in forests. So we've learned that, and now there are more management techniques of prescribed burning, but also clearing plants in a way that mimics fire. Also, the reintroduction of some native grazers. Um, you've heard of buffalo, bison that were hunted almost to extinction in the Midwestern United States in the 1800s, and that was mainly to harm the native peoples who lived. Their lifeways were very strongly linked to the life histories of the bison for food and culture, and it was really important. So that was the way the Europeans said, well, if we take that out, we can get rid of the native peoples, which is awful, but that is what was happening. Um, and some of and our prairies too, that many of them in turn have been converted to agriculture, but some restoration is occurring, prairie restoration and preservation, and we're finding we need to also put those native grazers that were native to those prairies and grasslands back on the land to reinstall that relationship that was important in keeping that land healthy. It's not just growing the plants so it looks pretty in the picture. You've got to have the animals there too that eat them and change that vegetative biomass into nutrients for the plants. Um, so there's that. If you think about around Santa Barbara area where our campus is, what did we have here? We had herds of pronghorn antelope that would come down from the mountains as it got drier towards the coast, eat the green grasses and we had a lot of grasslands in the coastal terrace here, and they would be hunted now and then. But that's another grazer that can be reintroduced like they were in Carrizo Plains, a national what is it, a refuge or a national wildlife area. A great place to visit and camp. So it's known now, these land managers and through ecology, that these native grazers are essential to sustain the grasslands and prairies for the future. What if we put too much livestock? So we're not talking about the native grazers, the pronghorn antelope from here, bison from the Midwest. We're talking about when people clear an area and then put their cattle on it. They have around here, there's still cattle here, even on the Gaviota Coast. There's cattle in in Los Padres National Forest. There's plenty that they're still using either federal land or private land to have cattle on. Well, if you have too many cattle in an area that's not big enough for them to roam around, then they degrade, they chew the plants down to the ground over and over until the plants die. The roots of the plants die. The soil doesn't hold as much moisture. You get erosion and what's called desertification. Overgrazing, too many cattle or livestock in an area will cause desertification and loss of topsoil and really complete disassembly of that ecosystem. One really neat method that was developed by Alan Savory in South Africa, actually, but not I think it was Zimbabwe. It wasn't in the country of South Africa, but Southern Africa, was holistic range management. And he was a rancher and he started theorizing. He was also a scientist and saying like, well, if we move our livestock around a big area, but not keeping them on one site for any, like one pasture for too long, and also not have a low abundance, then they can mimic like the migrations of native ungulates, two-hooved organisms, either deer, antelope. It will seem they will be acting like them and they won't degrade any one site too much. Just keep moving them around. It's called a rotational or holistic range management. And some of that is being implemented now in commercial livestock industries. So that's a positive note. So we'll shift a little into talking about protected areas, not just management and conservation. Conservation more means humans are really using an area and managing it and doing some activity there, where protected areas is more of a shift to talking and thinking about areas we don't go into and use and take anything from. We're just protecting it. So that's what this little section is about. This is a list of the ways that protected areas support the nearby unprotected areas, so they affect each other, and an explanation of limitations of protected areas, what they can do and what they cannot. And this is an explanation in text of the 3 different strategies that can be used to protect land: land trusts, conservation easements, and tradable development rights. Let's look at marine protected areas, the reserves, and the network of reserves. There are a lot of marine reserves around the world now, which is great, as opposed to 50 years ago, almost none. The limitation of them is you can see like just the ones here near Santa Barbara, the Channel Islands, and all the marine protected areas is they're fragmented. So they are really a positive thing, but they're not enough. We need more, and the area throughout the world of marine habitats that are protected is fairly small, as you'll see in the next slide. But positive notes, we've got some around our Channel Islands, and the proposed one, which I don't really know the latest on it, but just recently last year is being proposed. This Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, going from Santa Barbara all the way up to Cambria. I think it's probably going to go through, and that's a big achievement. And the bad news, as I said in the last slide, only 0.8% of the world's oceans are protected, and only 0.08 is in an actual marine reserve. So there are some areas that are protected but not in a reserve. So we've got a long ways to go. So it's not just the square acreage that's important to look at when we talk about protected areas, it's also the configuration, the shape and the size and the layout of preserves or preserve networks. You can just see here on the right the reserve size. Of course, it's better to have a bigger one. Let's just say there's a circular in shape preserve somewhere. It's better to have a bigger one than a smaller one. But if you're going to have the square footage or acreage be the same, better to have one big one than a few little ones that equal the same amount. You can kind of imagine this too. The area between those where it says number of reserves and worse, those are areas that are not protected and sometimes weak or degraded habitats. The animals can't move as freely back and forth between those, so it tends to be a weaker system. Reserve proximity, if you are going to have those fragmented, have them as close together as possible. Connectivity, some way for animals, plants, propagules, pollen to freely flow back and forth between them is better and stronger of a system than if they're disconnected. A circle is better than something like an ellipse. If those were the exact same square footage or square acreage, it would be better to have it be circular because you have a bigger interior area that isn't close to the edge. The edge is the weaker part, the more vulnerable part. And having buffer zones around it where less human activity is happening, but not in the preserve, can really strengthen it as well. The idea of edge effects is an ecological concept. It means on the edge of preserves or on the edge of habitats is really where you have often the most vulnerable places for that preserve or habitat, but also often the most diverse. You have an area between two types of habitats. That's the edge. Like think of the ocean next to the land. Right there along where the beach is a very diverse area. Lots of different species right there in the ocean where it's shallow and you have rocks and tidal flow and lots of interesting dune species and beach species right next to it. Super diverse area. It tends to be ecologically diverse, but if in a preserve, it tends to be the area where there's less safety for the species living on that edge. If they're plants, it's drier, they're more exposed to weather or drought or disease. If they're animals, they're more exposed to predators on the edge. So having an interior area that's not edge and having that be big enough is really important for preserve management. When planning for protecting habitats and important natural areas, conservationists and wildlife managers will use this process called gap analysis. And it's the way they look for unprotected landscapes or gaps in the network of already protected lands, usually from a bigger scale. How can our new protected areas fill in a gap between other preserves that aren't connected? So there's like corridors for migration of plants and animals and easy movement and protection that becomes more contiguous. And geographic information systems are super great tools, really strong mapping, digital mapping, where you can do layers of maps on top of each other to see these gaps and to decide where to put new preserves. You can have one digital layer in your computer be the vegetation and maybe rivers, topography. Another layer would be the population of the species you're trying to protect and ecosystems, and through that see where they all stack up, where there's maybe land that can be purchased and there's a population of the protected species, the species that wants to be protected, like the bunting here, and the right vegetation habitat for it. All those together would be the prime areas to focus on conservation efforts, and the computers can really aid that. In creating protected areas, it's important to consider a few things like the home ranges of the animals. Where is the kind of the core of their habitat? Some animals, especially predators, will travel far to get their prey, but they still have one central area they come back to. Those are really important to consider. The idea of an ecological island Not it's not an ocean island or a lake island that has water around it, but it's a habitat that has perhaps agriculture around it or human development or even a very different habitat, so that that place where the animal survives, let's say it's a mountaintop where there's a forest, but if you go down from the mountain there's no forest, so those animals that need that forest habitat are on an island. They can't move freely down the mountain without going into a more dangerous habitat or one that provides less cover or food. So ecologically, it's an island for them. Humans can have done this often inadvertently. We've built up our cities and developments and agriculture and ranching, and so it's pushed some animals into these islands. And we need, when we're thinking about making more connectivity between preserves and filling the gaps in between the preserves, we have to think about joining these islands so there's movement between them. In the Santa Monica Mountains, that's been thought of, that Highway 101 goes right through the middle of it, and some animals like mountain lions need to cross from one side to the other, and they inadvertently or get hit, which is awful. And they've considered building bridges, so like vegetated wildlife bridges or corridors, so they could go from one side to the other, and they're not you know isolated on those two sides or endangered by going across the freeway. Here's pictures of what the wildlife corridors would look like on the upper right and do look like on the lower left. It's important to consider all the different stages of the life cycle of an organism too. If sometimes different stages of the life cycles inhabit and utilize different habitats. So like, for example, lots of tropical fish will, the eggs will be laid in the coastal mangrove, kind of quieter waters, warmer, more protected. And when those fish become juveniles, they move out into maturity and start to inhabit the reefs. So both reefs and mangroves would have to be protected to protect that species. Closer example would be like the bald eagle, which uses Santa Cruz Island to nest on, but it feeds only on ocean fish. So you couldn't just protect the land of Santa Cruz Island to protect the bald eagle. You'd also have to protect the waters around the island on which where the fish are that it feeds upon, as opposed to the Santa Cruz Island jay, which only lives on land, and you could just protect Santa Cruz Island would be enough to protect that species. You don't need to worry about the water. So these have to be taken into account when deciding on a preserve. I love this quote by Paul Hawken. If you look at the science about what is happening on Earth and aren't pessimistic, you don't understand the data. But if you meet the people who are working to restore this Earth and the lives of the poor, and you aren't optimistic, you haven't got a pulse. So it's being humorous there, but I'll show you at the end of this semester a really great video clip of his talk. But there's a lot to be hopeful for. A lot of people that are working towards saving all kinds of aspects of this planet, including humanity. Many places in the world now that used to get their economic viability, especially rural areas, through farming, ranching, hunting, ecotourism, people coming in just to visit the beautiful habitat, is bringing in money. So it's protecting the habitat and keeping it healthy is a economic endeavor and can help that area. There's also this new kind of word I just saw last year called voluntourism, meaning people want to go and travel on their vacation and volunteer, do work. Just helps bring in money and helps the preserves themselves to have people coming in to help plant plants or protect species. For example, helping native plants in a restoration area on a preserve, you can do that. Helping keep watch over sensitive animal breeding grounds like Coal Oil Point has the snowy plover docents. Lots of opportunities to get involved and help. It can really stave off any kind of environmental despair that creeps up. Community-based preservation is when you get the local community involved in the preservation of that site. Now, indigenous communities, land-based cultures, they already have done this for many millennia. They knew, and it was kind of required that their local area had to provide their food and water and resources, so they cared for it in a way that made sure it was sustainable. That knowledge can be integrated in involving a community in any way in keeping it protected. And we can work together to create resilient and biological and culturally strong communities. Couple of stories of hope, success. Sea otters were brought back from almost the brink of extinction. They were hunted off the coast of North America in the 1800s and early 1900s, down from 20,000 individuals to only 3,000. A ban hunting them in 1911 helped, and some have survived. Some also survived off the coast of Big Sur, and now there's approximately 3,000, although their range hasn't not re-expanded to original areas, but they are increasing in number, and that's great. Also, the Atlantic humpback whale was hunted to near extinction in the past, um, and now they were down to 450, today 25,000, so that's great. You can see them migrating back and forth off the coast here in Santa Barbara area. One more success story. The average numbers of young produced by different sizes of this coral trout. You can see as they get older, they produce more and more. And the reserve there in Baja, Cabo Pulmo Marine Reserve, has increased the population of these coral trouts by 460% in the last 10 years due to protective actions. Yay! Some good stuff is happening.